Imagine watching a teenage boy, barely old enough to understand the weight of the words leaving his mouth, sitting in a hard plastic chair under fluorescent lights that have been buzzing for so many hours that the sound has become indistinguishable from the ringing in his own ears, and on the videotape that is now rolling, he begins to describe in halting, uncertain detail how he attacked a woman he has never met. In a part of the park he may have passed through, but where he committed no crime, and his eyes are glassy and his voice is flat and his body has that particular stillness that comes not from calm, but from a kind of spiritual exhaustion so complete that the person inside has temporarily vacated. And if you watch this tape today, knowing what we now know, knowing that this boy and the 4 others who gave similar confessions were innocent, knowing that they would lose years of their lives, 6 years, 7 years, 13 years, for a crime committed by a single man who would not be identified for over a decade, the sensation you experience is not simply sadness or anger, but something more unsettling, something that crawls beneath your rational mind and nests there. Because what you are watching is a human being constructing a memory of something that never happened to him, assembling a narrative from fragments fed to him by the very people who are supposed to be searching for the truth, and the worst part, the part that keeps defense attorneys and psychologists and civil rights advocates awake at night, is how convincing it looks, how much it resembles a genuine confession, how easy it would be, if you did not know the ending of this story, to watch this tape and believe that this child was guilty. It was April 19th, 1989, and Central Park, that vast rectangle of manufactured wilderness in the heart of Manhattan, became the setting for a crime that would ignite a city already burning with racial tension and class anxiety, and the particular fear that comes from living in a place where violence feels both random and inevitable. A 28-year-old investment banker named Trisha Meili had gone for her evening jog along the park's northern trails, and she was found hours later, beaten so savagely that she had lost 75% of her blood, her skull fractured, her body temperature dropped to 84 degrees, and she would spend 12 days in a coma and would have no memory of the attack when she finally awoke. That same evening, groups of teenagers had been moving through the park, and police, responding to reports of harassment and assaults on other park-goers, began making arrests, and among those swept up were 5 boys: Corey Wise, who was 16, Yusef Salam, who was 15, Antron McCrae, who was 15, Raymond Santana, who was 14, and Kevin Richardson, who was 14. 5 Black and Latino teenagers from Harlem who would become known, in the breathless tabloid coverage that followed, as the Central Park 5, a name that would follow them like a brand for the rest of their lives. What happened next? In the precinct houses of Manhattan, in rooms where these boys were held for hours. 14 hours, 16 hours, in Corey Wise's case over 20 hours, without adequate legal representation, without a full understanding of their rights, without the cognitive armour that an adult might bring to the overwhelming psychological pressure of police interrogation. What happened in those rooms is both the subject of this story and a window into one of the most disturbing phenomena in the entire architecture of criminal justice. Because what happened is that all 5 of them confessed, on videotape, to participating in the attack on Trisha Meili, and their confessions were detailed and specific and vivid, and they were also, every single one of them, false. The confessions contradicted each other in significant ways. They contradicted the physical evidence. The DNA found on the victim matched none of the 5 boys. But in 1989, DNA analysis was still in its relative infancy as a forensic tool, and the confessions were vivid, and the public was terrified, and the city wanted someone to pay, and so 5 innocent teenagers were convicted and sentenced, and they served between 6 and 13 years in prison before, in 2002, a convicted serial rapist and murderer named Matias Reyes, already serving a life sentence, approached authorities and confessed to the rape of Trisha Meili, stating that he had acted alone, and DNA evidence confirmed his confession, and the convictions of all 5 men, for they were men now, their adolescence having been consumed by prison, were vacated. The Central Park 5 case is not where the story of false confessions begins, but it is perhaps the case that most nakedly exposes the question that sits at the centre of this entire subject, like a stone at the bottom of a well. And the question is this: why would an innocent person confess to a crime they did not commit? It seems, on its face, to be an irrational act, a violation of the most basic instinct of self-preservation. And when people who have never been in an interrogation room hear about false confessions, their first response is almost always disbelief. a reflexive certainty that they would never do such a thing, that no sane person would, that there must be something wrong with someone who would sit in a room and claim responsibility for a murder or a rape or an assault that they had nothing to do with. This disbelief is natural, it is also dangerously wrong, and the depth of that wrongness, the sheer scale of the problem of false confessions in the American criminal justice system, is something that researchers and advocates have spent decades trying to make visible, because the truth is that false confessions are not rare anomalies, not glitches in an otherwise reliable system, not the product of a few bad actors or unusual circumstances, but rather a systemic failure woven into the very methods and assumptions that law enforcement uses to investigate crime. The Innocence Project, founded in 1992 by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law in New York, has spent over 3 decades using DNA evidence to exonerate individuals who were wrongfully convicted, and the data they have accumulated tells a story that should trouble anyone who believes in the reliability of confessions as evidence of guilt. Of the first 375 DNA exonerations in the United States, approximately 29%, nearly 1 in 3, involved false confessions or false incriminating statements. Think about that number for a moment. Let it settle into your understanding. In roughly 3 out of every 10 cases where DNA evidence proved that the convicted person was innocent, that person had confessed to the crime or had made statements that were used to convict them of a crime they did not commit. And these are only the cases where DNA evidence existed and was preserved and was eventually tested. The visible portion of what researchers believe is a much larger iceberg of wrongful convictions hidden beneath the surface of a system that processes millions of cases, most of which will never be revisited, most of which involve people who do not have access to the resources and advocacy necessary to prove their innocence after the fact. Among proven false murder confessions, cases where we know with certainty that the person who confessed was innocent, the average sentence served before exoneration was 14 years. 14 years of a human life consumed by concrete and razor wire, and the particular psychological torment of knowing that you are innocent and being unable to make anyone believe you, because you once sat in a room and said the words that sealed your fate. These numbers represent real people. They represent Corey Wise, who entered prison at 16 and did not leave until he was 30. They represent Eddie Joe Lloyd, who was intellectually disabled and who confessed to a murder in Detroit after police told him that by confessing he would help them smoke out the real killer, and who spent 17 years in prison before DNA evidence proved his innocence. They represent hundreds of men and women whose stories we will explore in the hours to come, each one a testament to the fragility of truth when it is subjected to the pressures of the interrogation room. Psychologists who study false confessions have identified 3 broad categories, 3 distinct pathways by which an innocent person arrives at the point of claiming guilt, and understanding these categories is essential to understanding how the phenomenon works, because false confessions are not a single thing but a spectrum of psychological events, each with its own causes, its own mechanisms, and its own implications for how we think about the relationship between what people say and what is true. The first category is the voluntary false confession, in which a person comes forward and claims responsibility for a crime without any pressure from law enforcement at all. The second is the coerced compliant false confession, in which a person confesses because the pressures of the interrogation environment have become so overwhelming that they will say anything to make it stop, even though they know internally that they are innocent. And the third, perhaps the most disturbing of all, is the coerced internalized false confession, in which the interrogation process is so psychologically powerful that the suspect actually comes to believe, at least temporarily, that they committed the crime, their own memory bending and reshaping under the force of suggestion until they cannot distinguish between what they did and what they have been told they did. Each of these categories reveals something profound about the architecture of human psychology, about the ways in which our sense of self and our sense of truth can be manipulated, distorted, and ultimately overridden. And in the sections that follow, we will move through each one in detail, beginning with the phenomenon that seems, on its surface, the most inexplicable of all. The voluntary false confession presents a paradox that has fascinated psychologists and baffled investigators for as long as criminal justice systems have existed, because it involves a person who, without being subjected to any interrogation tactics, without being threatened or coerced or psychologically manipulated by police, walks into a station or picks up a phone or writes a letter and declares, "I did it. I am the one you are looking for." And the immediate question, why, opens onto a landscape of human motivation that is far more complex and far more varied than most people realize. To understand the voluntary false confession, it helps to begin with the case that first made the phenomenon impossible to ignore, and that case is the kidnapping and murder of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., the 20-month-old son of the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh, who was taken from his crib on the second floor of the Lindbergh home in Hopewell, New Jersey, on the evening of March 1st, 1932. The Lindbergh kidnapping was, at the time, the most publicized crime in American history. Charles Lindbergh was not merely famous, he was a national icon, the man who had flown solo across the Atlantic, and the kidnapping of his infant son provoked a frenzy of media coverage and public outrage that consumed the nation for months. A ransom was paid. The baby was found dead. And in the weeks and months that followed, something extraordinary happened. Over 200 people came forward and confessed to the crime. 200 people who had nothing to do with the kidnapping, who had never been to the Lindbergh estate, who could not have committed the crime, presented themselves to police or to the press and claimed that they were responsible. Some of them provided elaborate details. Some of them seemed utterly convinced of their own guilt. And the sheer volume of these false confessions created an investigative nightmare, diverting resources and attention from the actual search for the perpetrator, who would eventually be identified as Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German carpenter who was convicted and executed in 1936 in a trial that remains controversial to this day. The Lindbergh case established a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. When a crime captures the public imagination, when it becomes a media event, when the details are broadcast and discussed and analysed in living rooms and barbershops and newspaper columns across the country, it attracts false confessors the way a porch light attracts moths on a summer evening, drawing them in from the darkness with a force that is difficult for the rest of us to comprehend. We saw it again in 2006 when a man named John Mark Carr, a 41-year-old American teacher living in Thailand, contacted authorities and confessed to the 1996 murder of 6-year-old John Benet Ramsey, the child beauty queen whose death in her family's Boulder, Colorado home had become one of the most obsessively covered unsolved cases in American history. Carr's confession was detailed and emotional. He told investigators that he had been with John Benet when she died, that her death was an accident, that he had loved her. He was arrested in Bangkok and extradited to the United States in a media spectacle that briefly convinced much of the public that the decade-old mystery had finally been solved. But the confession collapsed almost immediately. Carr's DNA did not match the evidence found at the crime scene. Records showed that he had likely been in another state, possibly on another continent entirely, at the time of the murder. His ex-wife stated that he had been with her in Alabama during the Christmas of 1996. There was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime, no credible testimony, nothing but his own words, and his own words, it turned out, were worthless. The charges were dropped, and John Mark Carr became another entry in the long catalogue of people who confessed to famous crimes they did not commit, leaving behind the unanswered question of why. The psychology of the voluntary false confession is not a single explanation, but a constellation of motivations, some of which overlap and many of which coexist within the same individual. For some, the motivation is a desire for notoriety, a pathological craving for attention that finds its ultimate expression in claiming responsibility for a crime that has captured the world's attention. These individuals may be living lives of quiet anonymity, invisibility, marginalization, and the act of confessing to a famous crime is, in a perverse way, an act of self-creation, a way of stepping from the shadows into the light, even if that light is the harsh glare of criminal investigation. For a brief, intoxicating moment, they are someone. They are the person everyone is looking for. They are at the center of the story. And for individuals whose psychology is structured around the desperate need to be seen, to be acknowledged, to matter, that moment may feel worth any price, even the price of freedom. For others, the motivation is something darker and more complex, a phenomenon that psychologists call guilt displacement, in which a person who is tormented by guilt over some other aspect of their life, a failing, a transgression, a secret shame, finds a kind of psychological relief in confessing to a crime they did not commit. The confession serves as a proxy, a way of atoning for sins that feel too private or too shameful to confess directly. The person may not be fully conscious of this displacement. They may genuinely believe, at some level, that they deserve punishment, and the public crime provides a socially legible framework for that punishment, a structure within which their suffering can be organized and made meaningful. It is, in a sense, a form of self-sacrifice, though the sacrifice is offered not to justice, but to the individual's own tortured need for absolution. Mental illness, too, plays a significant role in voluntary false confessions, particularly psychotic disorders that involve delusions, hallucinations, or severely impaired reality testing. A person experiencing a psychotic episode may genuinely believe that they committed a crime, may have vivid hallucinatory memories of events that never occurred, may be unable to distinguish between the real and the imagined. The criminal justice system's frequent failure to identify and accommodate mental illness in the confession context is a subject we will return to later, but it is worth noting here that many voluntary false confessors are people who are profoundly unwell, people for whom the line between reality and delusion has dissolved, and whose confessions are symptoms of their illness rather than evidence of guilt. And then there is the motivation that is perhaps the most humanly comprehensible, even noble of all: protecting someone else. A parent who confesses to shield a child, a friend who takes the fall for someone they love, a gang member who accepts responsibility under the code of the street. These confessions are false in the factual sense. The person confessing did not commit the crime, but they are not irrational. They are, in their own way, deeply logical, driven by the calculation that the consequences of confession are preferable to the consequences of allowing someone else to be caught. The voluntary false confession reminds us that the relationship between confession and truth is not the simple, direct one that our legal system assumes it to be. Confession is not merely an act of reporting, it is an act of storytelling, of identity construction, of psychological negotiation, and the story a person tells about their guilt is shaped by forces that have nothing to do with whether they actually committed the crime in question. And if this were the only category of false confession, if the only people who falsely confessed were those who did so of their own volition, driven by their own psychological needs, the problem would be concerning but perhaps manageable, a known variable that investigators could learn to identify and account for. But voluntary false confessions are only the first and most visible layer of a much deeper problem, and to understand the rest, we must turn our attention to the interrogation room itself, to the methods and techniques that American law enforcement has used for decades to extract confessions from suspects, and in particular to the single most influential interrogation methodology in the history of American policing, the Reid Technique. The story of the Reid Technique begins with a man named Johnny Reid, a former police officer and polygraph examiner who, in the 1940s and 1950s, developed a systematic approach to interrogation that would fundamentally transform how American law enforcement extracted confessions from criminal suspects. Reid, working initially in Chicago, became convinced that the key to effective interrogation was not physical coercion, the third-degree tactics of beatings and sleep deprivation and threats that had characterized earlier eras of policing, but rather psychological manipulation, a carefully choreographed sequence of techniques designed to break down a suspect's resistance and guide them, step by step, toward the act of confession. In 1962, Reid and his associate Fred Inbow published a book titled Criminal Interrogation and Confessions, which laid out the Reid technique in comprehensive detail, and this book became, and for decades remained, the Bible of American interrogation practice. The Reid technique was taught in police academies across the country, it was adopted by federal agencies, it was endorsed by prosecutors and courts. Johnny Reid and Associates, the consulting firm that bears Reid's name, has trained hundreds of thousands of law enforcement professionals in its methods, and while the technique has evolved and been updated over the decades, its fundamental architecture, its assumptions, its strategies, its 9-step process, has remained remarkably consistent, and it is this architecture that we must examine in detail, because within its elegant, persuasive, and deeply problematic structure lies the mechanism by which innocent people are broken down and rebuilt as confessors. The Reid technique begins not in the interrogation room but before it, with what its practitioners call the factual analysis, a comprehensive review of all the evidence, all the witness statements, all the physical findings associated with the case. This preliminary phase is presented as a safeguard, a way of ensuring that investigators go into the interrogation with a solid understanding of the facts. But it also serves another purpose, one that is more subtle and more consequential. It establishes in the investigator's mind a narrative of the crime, a theory of what happened and who is responsible, and this narrative will shape everything that follows. Because the Reid technique is not, despite what its proponents claim, a neutral fact-finding process. It is a confirmation process. It begins with a hypothesis of guilt and works backward, marshalling psychological pressure to produce evidence, the confession, that confirms that hypothesis. After the factual analysis comes the behavioral analysis interview, a structured conversation in which the investigator asks the suspect a series of questions designed not to elicit information, but to assess the suspect's truthfulness through their verbal and nonverbal behavior. Reid practitioners are trained to interpret specific behavioral cues, eye contact, posture, hand movements, the way a person phrases their answers, as indicators of deception or truthfulness, and based on this assessment, the investigator makes a determination. This person is being truthful, or this person is lying. If the determination is that the suspect is lying, the interrogation proper begins. And here it is essential to pause and note something that decades of psychological research have demonstrated with overwhelming consistency. The behavioral cues that the Reid technique teaches investigators to interpret as signs of deception, avoiding eye contact, fidgeting, giving overly detailed or overly brief answers, displaying nervousness, are not in fact reliable indicators of lying. Study after study has shown that trained law enforcement professionals are no better than chance at detecting deception through behavioral observation, that the confidence they feel in their ability to read suspects is not matched by their actual accuracy, and that the behavioral analysis interview, far from being a scientific screening tool, is essentially an exercise in confirmation bias, a process by which investigators convince themselves that their pre-existing suspicion is correct and thereby give themselves psychological permission to proceed with the full force of the interrogation. Once the investigator has determined that the suspect is being deceptive, the 9 steps of the Reid technique unfold with the precision of a choreographed performance. Step 1 is the positive confrontation, and it is perhaps the most psychologically significant moment of the entire process, because it is the moment when the investigator looks the suspect in the eye and states, with absolute, unwavering certainty, that the suspect committed the crime. This is not a question. It is not an accusation hedged with qualifiers. It is a statement of fact delivered with the full weight of institutional authority. We know you did this. The evidence shows you did this. There is no doubt. The purpose of this confrontation is to establish a reality in the room, to create an environment in which the suspect's guilt is treated not as a hypothesis to be tested, but as an established truth to be acknowledged, and to convey to the suspect that denial is futile, that the question is not whether they committed the crime, but why, and what they are going to do about it now. Step 2 is theme development, and this is where the Reid technique reveals its most sophisticated understanding of human psychology, because theme development is essentially the process of providing the suspect with a moral framework within which the confession becomes not an act of self-destruction, but an act of redemption. The investigator develops a theme, a narrative explanation for the crime that minimizes the suspect's moral culpability, that offers them a way to understand their actions as understandable, even forgivable. Did you plan this, the investigator might say, or did it just happen in the heat of the moment? Because I think you're not the kind of person who planned something like this. I think something happened that night that pushed you over the edge, something that anyone might have responded to the same way. Were you under a lot of pressure? Were you drinking? Were you provoked? The theme provides the suspect with a story they can tell themselves about who they are. A story in which they are not a monster but a human being who made a mistake under difficult circumstances, and this story, this softened narrative of guilt, becomes the pathway along which the confession will eventually travel. Step 3 is handling denials, and this step is as revealing as any in the entire process, because it consists, essentially, of shutting down the suspect's attempts to assert their innocence. When a suspect says, "I didn't do this," the Reid-trained investigator does not treat this as potentially truthful information to be evaluated. Instead, the investigator treats the denial as an obstacle to be overcome, a barrier between the suspect and the confession that the investigator has already determined is forthcoming. The investigator interrupts the denial, talks over it, redirects the conversation back to the theme, refuses to allow the suspect to complete their statement of innocence. The message is clear and relentless. Your denial has been heard and rejected. It will not be accepted. It will not be explored. It is irrelevant to what is happening in this room. Step 4 is overcoming objections, which is distinct from handling denials in a way that reveals the technique's sophisticated understanding of how resistance operates. While a denial is a direct statement of innocence, I didn't do it, an objection is a reason why the suspect could not have done it. I wasn't there that night. I don't even know that person. I was at work. The Reid Technique teaches investigators to treat these objections not as leads to be investigated, but as signs that the suspect is weakening, that their resistance is shifting from blanket denial to specific excuses, and this shift is interpreted as progress, as evidence that the suspect is moving closer to confession. The investigator acknowledges the objection, appears to consider it, and then incorporates it into the theme. So you're saying you were at work? Okay, but something happened after work, didn't it? Something happened that you weren't expecting. The objection is not refuted so much as absorbed, metabolized, and recycled into the narrative of guilt. Step 5 involves what the Reid Technique calls retaining the suspect's attention, which in practice means that the investigator, recognizing that the suspect may be withdrawing into themselves, becoming passive, shutting down, uses physical proximity, direct eye contact, first name address, and emotional engagement to maintain a psychological connection with the suspect, to prevent them from retreating into a protective psychological shell where they might be able to resist the pressure being applied. The investigator may move closer, may lower their voice, may use a tone of warmth and understanding that contrasts with the earlier confrontation, creating a dynamic in which the suspect experiences the investigator as simultaneously a threat and an ally, a source of both pressure and comfort. And this dual role is not accidental. It is designed to create a state of psychological dependency in which the suspect begins to look to the investigator for guidance, for approval, for relief from the overwhelming stress of the situation. Step 6 is handling the suspect's passive mood, the point at which the suspect's active resistance has largely been broken and they enter a state of resignation, of quiet despair, of the particular kind of emotional exhaustion that comes from fighting a battle you have been told you cannot win. The investigator reads this shift and responds by intensifying the theme, by becoming more sympathetic, more understanding, more human, by offering the suspect emotional comfort that is conditional on movement toward confession. I can see this is weighing on you. I can see you want to get this off your chest. You'll feel better once you tell the truth. The investigator presents confession as relief, as catharsis, as the end of suffering, and for a suspect who has been in this room for hours, who is exhausted and frightened and disoriented, and who has been told repeatedly that their guilt is certain and their denial is pointless, the promise of relief can be almost irresistibly appealing. Step 7 is the alternative question, and it is here that the Reid Technique arrives at its most elegant and most dangerous mechanism. The alternative question presents the suspect with two possible explanations for the crime, both of which assume guilt. Did you plan this, or did it just happen? Was this your idea, or did someone else put you up to it? Did you do this because you were a bad person, or because you were in a bad situation? The genius of the alternative question is that it appears to offer choice, appears to give the suspect agency, but both options lead to the same destination, an admission of guilt. By choosing the less damning option, it just happened. I was in a bad situation, someone else put me up to it. The suspect feels as though they are managing the narrative, controlling the damage, making the best of an impossible situation, but what they are actually doing is confessing. The alternative question is the trapdoor through which innocent people fall into false confessions, because it reframes the act of confessing not as an admission of guilt, but as a choice between two types of guilt, and when you have been told for hours that your innocence is not an option, choosing the lesser guilt can feel like the most rational thing in the world. Step 8 is developing the oral confession, the process by which the investigator, having obtained the initial admission through the alternative question, now works with the suspect to elaborate that admission into a full narrative of the crime. This is where the details come in, and this is where the process becomes particularly dangerous in cases involving innocent suspects, because the investigator, who has spent hours studying the case file, who knows the details of the crime, may inadvertently, or in some cases deliberately, feed those details to the suspect, asking leading questions, correcting inconsistencies, guiding the narrative until it aligns with the known facts. The resulting confession can appear remarkably accurate, remarkably detailed, remarkably convincing, not because the suspect actually committed the crime, but because the suspect has been given the raw materials from which to construct a plausible narrative and has been coached subtly or overtly in how to assemble them. Step 9 is converting the oral confession into a written statement, a document that will be presented in court as evidence of the suspect's guilt, and this written statement, cleaned up and organised and stripped of the hours of psychological pressure that produced it, can appear to a jury as a straightforward, voluntary account of the crime, a document that speaks for itself, that seems to require no explanation beyond the obvious one. This person confessed because they are guilty. The proponents of the Reid Technique, and they are many, and they are vocal, and they include some of the most experienced and respected investigators in American law enforcement, argue that these 9 steps, properly applied, produce confessions only from guilty suspects, that the behavioral analysis interview screens out the innocent, that the themes and alternative questions merely help guilty people find the words to admit what they already know to be true, that the technique is a tool of justice, not a machine for manufacturing false evidence. They point to the thousands of cases in which the Reid Technique has produced confessions that were subsequently corroborated by physical evidence that led to the recovery of bodies or weapons or stolen property, that solved crimes that might otherwise have gone unsolved. And it is true that the Reid Technique has produced many true confessions from guilty people. It is also true that it has produced false confessions from innocent people, and the question of how many people have confessed to crimes they did not commit under the psychological pressure of the Reid Technique and its derivatives is a question that may never be fully answered, because the system that produces false confessions is the same system that processes and validates them, and in the absence of DNA evidence or the true perpetrator's confession, a false confession is, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from a true one. What the Reid Technique's proponents do not adequately address, what the entire edifice of American interrogation practice has been slow to acknowledge, is that the architecture of the technique, its fundamental design, is not a truth-finding mechanism, but a confession-producing mechanism, and while those two things often overlap, they are not the same thing, and the distance between them is measured in years of stolen freedom, and lives derailed, and families destroyed, and a justice system that has, in case after case after case, looked an innocent person in the eye and told them that they were guilty until they believed it, or at least until they said it, which in the eyes of the law amounts to the same thing. The 9 steps of the Reid Technique describe a psychological journey from resistance to surrender, from denial to admission, from I didn't do it to yes, I did. And the force that propels the suspect along this journey is not evidence but pressure, not truth but authority, not investigation but persuasion. And the question that will occupy us for the remainder of this exploration is what happens when that pressure is applied to someone who is telling the truth, when they say, I didn't do it. What happens when the machine designed to break down the guilty is turned upon the innocent? And the answer, as we will discover, is that the machine does not care. It works the same way regardless. It breaks down resistance, it produces confessions, and it cannot distinguish between the resistance of the guilty and the resistance of the innocent. Because to the Reid Technique, all resistance looks the same, all denial sounds the same, and the only acceptable outcome, the only endpoint toward which the entire process is oriented, is the confession itself. The words on the page, the statement signed, the case closed, and the suspect, guilty or innocent, it no longer matters, delivered into the hands of a system that will take those words and build a cage around them and call it justice. There is a moment in every false confession where the innocent person crosses a threshold, a line drawn not in sand but in the exhausted, trembling tissue of a mind, pushed past its capacity to resist, and on one side of that line stands the truth, fragile and unsupported, and on the other side stands a lie that everyone in the room seems to want, a lie that has been shaped and polished and presented as the only logical conclusion, the only reasonable path forward, and the tragedy of coerced compliant false confessions, the most common category of false confession documented by researchers, is that the person who crosses that line usually knows, at least on some flickering, diminished level, that they are innocent. They know they did not do what the detectives are saying they did, and yet they confess anyway, not because they have been convinced of their own guilt, not because they have lost their grip on reality entirely, but because the interrogation room has become a closed universe, a sealed chamber where the only currency that matters is compliance, where the only door that leads out of the pain and the pressure and the suffocating repetition swings open only when you say the words they have been waiting to hear. This is the confession born not of belief, but of desperation. The confession that emerges when a human being calculates, in some raw and primitive part of their brain, that the short-term relief of saying yes outweighs the long-term catastrophe of what that yes will mean. And to understand how this calculation can go so terribly wrong, you have to understand what happens to the human mind when it is placed under the kind of sustained, unrelenting psychological pressure that a modern interrogation can exert over hours and hours and hours without end. The psychology of short-term thinking under extreme stress is one of the most well-documented phenomena in cognitive science, and it explains why innocent people do things that seem, from the outside, utterly inexplicable. When a person is subjected to prolonged stress, when cortisol levels have been elevated for hours, when adrenaline has surged and crashed and surged again, when sleep has been denied and food withheld, when the same questions have been asked dozens or hundreds of times in slightly different configurations, when every denial has been met with louder, more insistent accusations, something fundamental changes in the way the brain processes decisions. The prefrontal cortex, that structure behind your forehead responsible for weighing consequences, for projecting yourself into the future, begins to falter under the chemical assault of prolonged stress, and as it falters, the brain's decision-making shifts toward more primitive, more immediate calculations. The question stops being, what will happen to the rest of my life? And becomes simply, what will make this stop right now? And this shift is not a sign of weakness or stupidity or moral failure. It is a neurological response, as predictable and as mechanical as the dilation of a pupil in darkness, and it can happen to anyone. To the intelligent and the educated and the strong-willed, given enough time and enough pressure. The interrogation room becomes the entire universe, its fluorescent lights the only sun, its cinder block walls the boundaries of all existence, and within that universe the only thing that matters is how to make the pain stop. And the answer, presented over and over by the detectives, is breathtakingly simple. Just tell us what happened, just admit what you did, just tell us the truth, and this will all be over, you can go home, you can sleep, just tell us what we already know. The phrase that echoes through the accounts of countless false confessors is devastatingly ordinary. I just told them what they wanted to hear. Not because they believed it, but because the machinery of their rational mind had been ground down to nothing, and all that remained was the animal need to escape, and the only escape route available was paved with the words the detectives had been feeding them for hours. Sleep deprivation is perhaps the most powerful weapon in the interrogator's arsenal, and it is wielded with a frequency and a casualness that would shock most people who have never found themselves on the wrong side of an interrogation table. Interrogations lasting 12 hours are common. 16 hours is not unusual. 20 hours and beyond occurs with a regularity that the legal system has been remarkably slow to address. The average police interrogation lasts between 30 minutes and 2 hours when the suspect is cooperative. But when the suspect maintains their innocence, the interrogation can stretch on and on, doubling and tripling in length, because the Reid Technique and its descendants teach interrogators to interpret denial, not as evidence of innocence but as a barrier to be overcome through persistence and psychological leverage. And so, the hours accumulate, and with each passing hour the suspect's cognitive resources diminish, their resistance weakens, and the interrogator, who may be working in shifts with fresh partners rotating in every few hours, remains sharp and relentless while the suspect deteriorates. Research on sleep deprivation has shown that after 17 to 19 hours without sleep, cognitive impairment is equivalent to having a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05%, and after 24 hours without sleep, the impairment is equivalent to a blood alcohol concentration of 0.10%, legally drunk in every jurisdiction in the United States. And yet we take confessions extracted after 20 or more hours of interrogation and present them to juries as reliable evidence of guilt, as if the words spoken by a person in a state of cognitive impairment, equivalent to legal intoxication, should be trusted as an accurate account of their actions and intentions. The case of Peter Riley illustrates this dynamic with a clarity that is almost unbearable. On the evening of September 28, 1973, in the small town of Canaan, Connecticut, 18-year-old Peter Riley came home to find his mother, Barbara Gibbons, brutally murdered, her body bearing wounds so savage and so numerous that the scene was described by the responding officers as one of the worst they had ever encountered. Peter called for help, visibly distraught, a teenager who had just discovered his mother's mutilated body, and in any reasonable world the first response would have been to treat him as a victim. Instead, the investigation quickly focused on Peter himself, and what followed was an interrogation lasting more than 25 hours, an ordeal that would transform a grieving teenager into a confessed killer, through a process so psychologically devastating that it became one of the landmark cases in the study of false confessions. The detectives brought Peter into the police station and began questioning him, and as the hours passed, as midnight gave way to the small hours of the morning, and the morning gave way to another afternoon, Peter was told that he had failed a polygraph examination, that the lie detector had determined with scientific certainty that he was not telling the truth when he said he did not kill his mother. This was presented to him not as a possibility, but as an absolute, irrefutable fact, and Peter, an 18-year-old with no experience of the criminal justice system, with no understanding of the unreliability of polygraph examinations, with no lawyer present to explain that polygraph results are inadmissible in most courts precisely because they are not reliable, had no framework for challenging this assertion. The detectives told him the machine had spoken, and the machine said he was lying, and in the face of that mechanical authority, the authority of science as wielded by men in positions of power, Peter's certainty in his own innocence began to crack. You can hear it in the transcripts, that slow, terrible erosion, and if you listen carefully you can hear the exact moment when the ground gives way beneath him. After hour upon hour of being told that the evidence proved he had done it, that the polygraph confirmed he had done it, that there was no other possible explanation, Peter Riley, exhausted and confused and desperately trying to reconcile his own memory of innocence with the apparent certainty of the men questioning him, said the words that would haunt him, "Well, it really looks like I did it." Not "I did it." Not a confident declaration of guilt, but a bewildered, tentative capitulation to the version of reality that the interrogators had constructed around him. A surrender not of truth, but of the energy required to keep fighting for truth against the overwhelming pressure to stop. Peter Riley was convicted of manslaughter in 1974. He was eventually exonerated when evidence emerged that another person had committed the murder, evidence that had been suppressed by the prosecution, and his case became a cause célèbre in Connecticut, a rallying point for those who understood the dangers of coercive interrogation techniques. But before the exoneration came the conviction, and before the conviction came the confession, and before the confession came the 25 hours of relentless psychological pressure that turned an innocent teenager into a person who could no longer trust his own memory, his own mind, his own basic understanding of what he had and had not done. The vulnerability of certain populations to this kind of pressure cannot be overstated, and nowhere is this vulnerability more heartbreaking or more consequential than in the cases involving people with intellectual disabilities, juveniles, and individuals with mental health conditions. The case of Henry Lee McCollum and Leon Brown stands as one of the most devastating examples of what can happen when coercive interrogation techniques are deployed against people who lack the cognitive resources to resist them. In 1983, in the small town of Red Springs, North Carolina, an 11-year-old girl named Sabrina Bui was found dead in a soybean field, the victim of a rape and murder that horrified the community and created enormous pressure on law enforcement to find those responsible. Suspicion fell on Henry Lee McCollum, who was 19 years old, and his half-brother Leon Brown, who was just 15, and both young men were intellectually disabled, with IQ scores that placed them well below the threshold for normal cognitive functioning. They were brought in for questioning, and what happened in those interrogation rooms is a story of systemic failure so profound that it defies easy comprehension. Henry Lee McCollum was interrogated for approximately 5 hours, and during that time, without a lawyer present, without a parent or guardian to advocate for him, without anyone in the room who had his interests at heart, he was pressured into signing a confession that had been written by the investigators. Leon Brown, 15 years old and intellectually disabled, endured a similar process. The confessions were detailed and specific, and they bore all the hallmarks not of genuine recollection, but of information that had been fed to the suspects by the investigators, a phenomenon known as contamination, where the details in a confession come not from the confessor's actual knowledge of the crime, but from facts supplied. deliberately or inadvertently, by the people conducting the interrogation. Neither Henry Lee McCollum nor Leon Brown had the cognitive capacity to fully understand what was happening to them, to comprehend the long-term consequences of the documents they were signing, to exercise the kind of strategic, future-oriented thinking that might have led them to refuse to cooperate. They were scared and confused and desperate to please the authority figures who surrounded them, and they did what so many people with intellectual disabilities do when confronted with authority and pressure. They complied. They said what was expected of them. They signed what was put in front of them. And for this compliance, for this act of desperate, uncomprehending acquiescence, they were sentenced to death. Henry Lee McCollum and Leon Brown spent 30 years on death row for a crime they did not commit. In 2014, DNA evidence identified the actual perpetrator, a man named Roscoe Artis, who lived near the crime scene and who had committed a similar crime just weeks after Sabrina Boy's murder. McCollum and Brown were exonerated and released, blinking into a world that had changed beyond recognition during the 30 years they had been caged. But the years could not be returned to them, the youth could not be restored, and the fact that their confessions that were the product of intellectual disability meeting coercive interrogation, had been treated as reliable evidence of guilt for 3 decades, stands as an indictment of a system that places far too much faith in the ritual of confession and far too little scrutiny on the conditions under which confessions are obtained. Juveniles are particularly susceptible to the pressures of interrogation, and the research on this point is overwhelming and unambiguous. The adolescent brain is not a finished product. The prefrontal cortex, that seat of long-term planning and impulse control and consequence evaluation, does not fully mature until the mid-20s, and in teenagers the neural architecture that supports rational decision-making under pressure is literally physically neurologically incomplete. Adolescents are more susceptible to authority, more sensitive to immediate rewards and punishments, more likely to discount future consequences in favour of immediate relief, and more vulnerable to suggestion than adults. And all of these characteristics make them profoundly vulnerable in the interrogation room. When a detective tells a 15-year-old that they will go home if they just admit what they did, the adolescent brain is wired to focus on that promise of immediate relief in a way that an adult brain might be better equipped to resist. This does not mean adults are immune. The pressures of prolonged interrogation can overwhelm even the most mature prefrontal cortex. But juveniles start from a position of greater vulnerability, and the gap between what they can resist and what the interrogation demands is narrower from the beginning. People with mental health conditions, depression, anxiety disorders, psychotic disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, are similarly vulnerable because these conditions compromise many of the same cognitive functions that are targeted by coercive interrogation techniques. A person in the grip of a depressive episode may already struggle with self-worth and self-trust, making them more susceptible to the suggestion that they are the kind of person who could commit a terrible act. A person with anxiety may find the stress of interrogation magnified beyond what a neurotypical person would experience, reaching the breaking point faster and with less provocation. A person experiencing psychotic symptoms may have difficulty distinguishing between reality and suggestion, between actual memory and implanted narrative. And across all of these populations there runs a common thread. The interrogation techniques used by law enforcement were developed with the assumption that the person being interrogated is guilty, designed to extract truthful confessions from people hiding their guilt. And when these techniques are applied to people who are actually innocent, they become instruments not of justice but of injustice, machines for manufacturing false evidence with devastating efficiency. But there is a category of false confession that goes beyond mere compliance, beyond the calculated surrender of the coerced compliant confessor, and it is perhaps the most psychologically disturbing phenomenon in the entire landscape of wrongful convictions. In coerced internalized false confessions, the suspect does not merely say the words the interrogators want to hear, while privately knowing they are innocent. The suspect actually comes to believe, on some genuine and terrifying level, that they committed the crime. They develop false memories. They construct narratives of guilt that feel real to them. They lose the ability to distinguish between what actually happened and what they have been told happened, and they emerge from the interrogation room not as reluctant actors playing a part, but as people who are genuinely confused about their own past, their own actions, their own identity. To understand how this is possible, You have to understand the extraordinary fragility of human memory, a fragility that runs counter to everything we intuitively believe about how our minds work. We tend to think of memory as a recording device, a faithful archive that captures events as they happen and stores them for later retrieval, like a video camera filming our lives and filing the footage in some neural library. But this is not how memory works, not even approximately. Memory is a constructive process, an act of imagination as much as an act of recollection, and every time we remember something, we are not playing back a recording but rebuilding the memory from fragments, filling in gaps with assumptions and expectations and suggestions, and the rebuilt version becomes the new memory, replacing whatever came before. This means that memories can be altered, reshaped, even created from nothing, given the right conditions and the right kind of pressure, and the interrogation room provides exactly those conditions with a precision that could not be more effective if it had been deliberately designed to exploit the weaknesses of human memory, which, in a sense, it has been. The case of Tom Sawyer, and this is a real person, not the literary character, a real man whose life was devastated by a process that most people would consider impossible, illustrates the mechanics of internalized false confession with painful clarity. Tom Sawyer was a recovering alcoholic living a quiet life in Virginia when his neighbor was raped and murdered. And because Sawyer had a history of alcohol abuse, and because he had been seen in the vicinity of the crime, he became a person of interest in the investigation. He was brought in for questioning, and what followed was an interrogation that lasted 16 hours. 16 hours during which detectives confronted him with what they presented as overwhelming evidence of his guilt. 16 hours during which they suggested scenarios and offered details, and built a narrative of the crime that grew more detailed and more specific with each passing hour. And as the hours accumulated, as exhaustion and stress and the relentless pressure of accusation wore away at his cognitive defenses, something happened to Tom Sawyer that he had never imagined possible. He began to wonder if they were right. He had been a heavy drinker. He had experienced blackouts before, episodes of alcohol-induced amnesia where he had done things he could not later remember. And the detectives used this vulnerability, this crack in his self-knowledge, as a lever, suggesting that perhaps he had committed the crime during one of these blackout episodes, that perhaps his inability to remember doing it was not evidence of innocence, but evidence of the very dissociative mechanisms that had caused his blackouts in the past. And in his exhausted, depleted, psychologically battered state, Tom Sawyer found that he could not refute this logic with absolute certainty. He could not prove that he had not done something he could not remember, and the detective's certainty, their calm, professional, unwavering assertion that the evidence proved his guilt, began to erode his own certainty about his innocence. He began to think that maybe, possibly, in some terrible way that he could not access through his own memory, he had done what they said he had done. He began to doubt himself. He began to construct hypothetical scenarios in which he might have committed the crime without remembering it. He began, in other words, to internalize the guilt that the interrogators had been projecting onto him for 16 hours. And the confession that emerged was not the reluctant, strategic compliance of a person saying what they need to say to escape. It was the bewildered, horrified expression of a man who genuinely no longer knew whether he was innocent or guilty. Tom Sawyer was eventually cleared of any involvement in the crime, but the psychological damage was profound and lasting, and his case became a cornerstone in the research literature on internalized false confessions, a real-world demonstration that the human mind, under sufficient pressure, can be made to doubt even its most fundamental certainties about its own history. The case of the Norfolk Four carries the phenomenon of internalized false confession to an even more extreme and more troubling degree. In 1997, in Norfolk, Virginia, a young woman named Michelle Moore Bosco was raped and murdered in her apartment, and in the investigation that followed, 4 United States Navy sailors, Daniel Williams, Joseph Dick Jr., Derek Tice, and Eric Wilson, confessed to participating in the crime. Their confessions were detailed. They described the crime with specificity. Some of the men developed what appeared to be genuine memories of participating in the assault and the murder, and yet DNA evidence found at the scene matched none of them. It matched a single individual, a man named Omar Ballard, who eventually confessed to committing the crime alone, and whose DNA was the only biological evidence linking anyone to the crime scene. Despite this, despite the fact that the physical evidence pointed to a single perpetrator and excluded all 4 of the confessing sailors, the confessions were treated as powerful evidence, and 3 of the 4 men were convicted and sentenced to life in prison, while the 4th received a lesser sentence. The question that haunts the Norfolk Four case, the question that haunts everyone who studies it, is how 4 separate men could confess to a crime that none of them committed, and develop what appeared to be memories of participating in events that never happened. The answer lies in the intersection of coercive interrogation and the malleability of human memory, and it connects directly to the groundbreaking research of Elizabeth Loftus, a cognitive psychologist whose work on false memories has fundamentally changed our understanding of how the mind constructs and reconstructs its version of the past. Loftus demonstrated through decades of rigorous experimental research that it is remarkably easy to implant false memories in the human mind, that with the right combination of suggestion, authority, and repetition, people can be made to remember events that never occurred with vivid sensory detail and genuine emotional conviction. In her famous Lost in the Mall study, Loftus and her colleagues showed that approximately 25% of participants could be made to develop detailed, emotionally rich memories of being lost in a shopping mall as a child, an event that had never happened, that had been fabricated by the researchers and presented to the participants as a real memory shared by family members. The participants did not merely agree that the event had happened, they embellished it, adding details and sensory impressions and emotional textures that went far beyond anything the researchers had suggested, because the memory construction process, once activated, draws on the brain's vast repertoire of stored experiences and associations to build something that feels complete and authentic and real. If a quarter of people can develop vivid false memories of a relatively benign event like being lost in a mall based on nothing more than the suggestion of a trusted source, imagine what becomes possible when the suggestion comes from a figure of institutional authority, when it is delivered over the course of hours and hours of relentless interrogation, when the subject is sleep-deprived and terrified and cognitively depleted, when the stakes are not a childhood memory but a murder charge, when every denial is met with louder and more insistent assertion, and every moment of resistance is punished with more pressure and more aggression. Under these conditions, the mind's capacity to generate false memories is amplified enormously, and people who would never, under normal circumstances, doubt their own recollection of events can find themselves constructing detailed, emotionally compelling narratives of crimes they did not commit. The interrogator plays a crucial role in this process, because the interrogator functions as the authority figure whose certainty provides the scaffolding on which the false memory is built. When a detective sits across the table from a suspect and says, with calm, unwavering conviction, "We know you did this, the evidence proves you did this, there is no doubt whatsoever that you did this," the detective is not merely making an accusation. The detective is providing a framework of certainty that the exhausted, suggestible suspect can use to resolve the agonizing cognitive dissonance between their own fading sense of innocence and the apparently overwhelming case against them. The suspect thinks, these people are professionals, they have training and evidence and technology, they have devoted their careers to distinguishing guilt from innocence, and they are telling me with absolute certainty that I did this. So maybe they are right. Maybe I did do it and I just cannot remember. Maybe there is something wrong with my memory. And once that door of self-doubt opens even a crack, the suggestion-rich environment of the interrogation room floods in like water through a breach in a dam, and the false memory begins to take shape, assembling itself from fragments of the interrogator's suggestions, from the suspect's own fears and insecurities, from the brain's relentless need to construct a coherent narrative that explains the available evidence, even when the available evidence has been carefully curated and selectively presented by the very people who are most invested in obtaining a confession. Understanding why people break under interrogation requires a deep dive into the cognitive science of decision-making under stress, and the picture that emerges from decades of research is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The concept of decision fatigue, the deterioration of decision-making quality after a long session of making decisions, applies with devastating force to the interrogation room. Every time the suspect must formulate a denial, every time they must marshal their cognitive resources to counter an accusation or resist a suggestion, they are drawing on a finite pool of mental energy, and as that pool depletes over hours of interrogation, the quality of their decisions deteriorates in predictable ways. They become more impulsive, more susceptible to suggestion, less capable of weighing long-term consequences against short-term relief. They become, in the language of psychology, ego-depleted, a state in which the executive functions of the brain, the very functions that allow a person to resist temptation and make decisions that serve their long-term interests, are diminished to the point of near collapse. The concept that researchers have termed the myopia of the moment describes what happens to cognition under these conditions with precise and illuminating accuracy. When the brain's prefrontal cortex, that evolutionary marvel responsible for planning, for abstract reasoning, for projecting oneself into the future and evaluating the consequences of present actions, is overwhelmed by sustained stress, when the neurochemical environment of the brain has been altered by hours of cortisol and adrenaline flooding through the system, a shift occurs in the brain's decision-making architecture. The prefrontal cortex, energy-hungry and metabolically expensive to operate, begins to lose its grip on the decision-making process, and the amygdala, the brain's ancient fear center, the structure that drives fight or flight responses, the part of the brain that is concerned not with next year or next month or next week, but with right now, this moment, this second, takes over. And when the amygdala is driving decisions, the calculus changes completely. The question is no longer what will a confession mean for the rest of my life, but what will end the fear and the pain and the pressure I am experiencing right now, in this moment, in this room. This is the myopia of the moment, the radical narrowing of temporal perspective that occurs when stress pushes the brain out of its rational planning mode and into its survival mode. And in survival mode, the brain makes decisions that are optimized for immediate relief, not for long-term outcomes. The feeling of inevitability is another powerful force that drives innocent people toward false confessions, a feeling the interrogation process is designed to cultivate. When detectives tell a suspect over and over that the evidence is overwhelming, that their guilt is certain, that there is no way they will be acquitted at trial, they are constructing a psychological reality in which resistance feels futile, in which maintaining innocence feels pointless. The suspect begins to think, they already believe I did it. They will tell the prosecutor will tell the jury, and the jury will believe them, so what is the point of fighting? This sense of futility is one of the most corrosive forces at work in the interrogation room because it strips away the very motivation that keeps innocent people fighting. The belief that the truth will ultimately prevail, that innocence will be recognized, that the system will work as it is supposed to work. When that belief is destroyed, when the suspect has been persuaded that their innocence is irrelevant because the system has already decided their guilt, the incentive structure of the interrogation shifts dramatically. Maintaining innocence no longer feels like a strategy for freedom. It feels like a futile gesture that will only prolong the suffering, and confession, paradoxically, begins to look like the rational choice. Because at least confession offers the possibility of a deal, the possibility of leniency, the possibility of some measure of control over a process that has otherwise been entirely outside the suspect's power to influence. This brings us to the twin techniques of maximization and minimization, central to interrogation methods taught across the country and operating as a psychological pincer movement designed to channel the suspect toward confession. Maximization emphasizes the severity of the crime and the certainty of punishment. The detective leans forward, raises their voice, and paints a picture of the worst possible outcome, the maximum sentence, the decades in prison, the destruction of everything the suspect holds dear. This is the stick designed to create fear, to amplify the sense that the suspect is facing a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Then, often seamlessly, the interrogation shifts to minimization. The detective leans back, softens their voice, and offers a different narrative, a kinder story, one in which the crime was understandable, perhaps even justified, in which anyone might have done the same thing under similar circumstances, in which the suspect is not a monster but a human being who made a mistake, and in which cooperation, honesty, and confession will be met with understanding and fairness. This is the carrot, and it is designed to create hope, to suggest that there is a path through the catastrophe that does not lead to total destruction, and that path runs directly through confession. The minimization technique is particularly insidious because of the implicit promises it carries, promises never stated explicitly, because explicit promises of leniency would constitute coercion under the law and render the confession inadmissible, but communicated through tone and framing with such clarity that the suspect would have to be extraordinarily sophisticated to recognize the gap between what is implied and what is actually promised. When a detective says, "Look, I think this was a situation that got out of hand. I think you're a good person who made a mistake, and if you just tell us what happened, we can work this out." The detective has not promised leniency, has not guaranteed a reduced charge, but the suspect, exhausted and frightened, hears something very different. "If I confess, they will go easy on me. If I confess, this nightmare will end, and I will be treated with the compassion this detective is implying." The implicit promise is the shadow companion of the minimization technique, the unspoken bargain that the detective carefully constructs without ever formally proposing, and it is one of the most powerful drivers of false confession because it transforms the act of confessing from an admission of defeat into what feels like a strategic choice, a calculated move toward a better outcome. The innocent suspect, operating under decision fatigue and ego depletion, and the myopia of the moment and the feeling of inevitability, makes a calculation. I am going to be convicted anyway because they will never believe I am innocent. So it is better to confess and get the leniency they are implying than to maintain my innocence and face the maximum punishment they are threatening. This is a rational calculation given the information provided, but it is based on premises that are false. False because the evidence may not be as strong as claimed. False because the detectives have no authority to offer leniency. False because the act of confession will become the single most powerful piece of evidence against the suspect at trial, the thing that juries find most compelling, the thing that will follow the suspect through every appeal and every moment of the decades that may follow. The innocent person confesses expecting understanding and finds only condemnation. They confess expecting leniency and receive the maximum sentence. They confess expecting that the truth will eventually come out and discover that the confession has become the truth in the eyes of the system. A truth so powerful that no amount of recantation, no amount of contradictory evidence, no amount of logical argument can dislodge it from the minds of the jurors who heard it, and the judges who admitted it, and the prosecutors who built their case upon it. And so the false confession, born of desperation and exhaustion, and the perfectly natural human desire to make the pain stop, becomes a prison of its own. A cage of words that the innocent person will spend years, sometimes decades, sometimes the rest of their life trying to escape, rattling the bars of a cell built not from steel but from the syllables they spoke in a moment of broken surrender, in a fluorescent lit room, in the small hours of a morning that felt like it would never end, when the only thing that mattered, the only thing that existed, was the overwhelming, all-consuming need to make it stop, to say the words, to sign the paper, to cross the threshold, to step through the door that the detectives were holding open, the door that seemed to lead to relief but led instead to ruin, the door that closed behind them with a sound they would hear in their dreams for the rest of their lives, the soft click of a lock turning, the quiet, final sound of a life sealed away inside a lie. There is a phrase that echoes through courtrooms like a verdict before the verdict, a phrase so potent that it can override alibis, contradict forensic evidence, and silence the protests of the accused with a finality that feels almost surgical in its precision. And that phrase is this: only the killer could have known that detail. It is offered by prosecutors with the quiet confidence of someone laying down an ace, presented to jurors as ultimate proof that the defendant is the very individual who committed the crime, because how else could they have described the position of the body, the type of weapon, the location of the wound, the colour of the victim's clothing? How else could they have known these things unless they were there, unless their hands were the ones that carried out the terrible deed, unless they stood in that room and did the things that were done there? This is the guilty knowledge argument, and on its surface it possesses a logic that feels unassailable, a kind of common-sense reasoning that requires no expertise to follow, and it is precisely this intuitive power that makes it so dangerous, because the guilty knowledge argument rests on a foundation that crumbles the moment you examine how confessions are actually produced in the interrogation room, the moment you understand that details travel not from the suspect's memory to the detective's notebook, but in the opposite direction entirely, from the detective's case file into the suspect's narrative, contaminating the confession so thoroughly that by the time the final statement is recorded, it is impossible to determine which details originated in the mind of the confessor and which were planted there, carefully, incrementally, sometimes deliberately, and sometimes without the interrogator even realizing what they have done. This is the contamination problem, and it's one of the most insidious mechanisms by which false confessions acquire the appearance of truth. Because once a confession contains accurate crime scene details, it becomes exponentially more difficult to challenge, more difficult for defense attorneys to explain, more difficult for jurors to dismiss, and most devastatingly, more difficult for appellate courts to overturn, even when every other piece of evidence points toward innocence. The contamination of confessions happens through multiple channels, some obvious and some so subtle that even experienced investigators fail to recognize them in the moment, fail to see the way their own words are building a bridge across which information travels from one mind to another. The most direct form is the explicit disclosure of crime scene information during questioning, moments when a detective says we know she was stabbed 17 times, or we know the point of entry was through this basement window, and these statements, delivered in the context of a confrontational interrogation, are not merely informational but instructional, telling the suspect what details need to appear in the confession for it to be accepted as genuine, and a suspect who has been interrogated for hours and broken down to the point of agreeing they committed the crime will absorb these details and incorporate them into their narrative with desperate efficiency, because at that stage the suspect's primary goal is no longer to maintain innocence, but to produce a statement that will satisfy their interrogators and bring the ordeal to an end. Then there is the subtler contamination that occurs through leading questions, questions that contain their own answers like seeds waiting to germinate. Questions like, so after you stabbed her, did you wash the knife in the kitchen sink or the bathroom sink? A question that appears to offer a choice but communicates three pieces of information simultaneously: that the victim was stabbed, that a knife was used, and that the knife was washed, and the suspect, regardless of which option they select, has now produced a statement containing accurate crime scene details they did not possess before the question was asked. Details that will later be cited by prosecutors as proof that only the true perpetrator could have known what happened. There is also the iterative process of shaping a confession, unfolding over hours and sometimes days, during which the suspect offers a version of events that is rejected as incomplete, and the suspect is sent back to try again, to think harder, and with each iteration the investigators provide feedback that guides the suspect toward a narrative aligning more closely with the known facts, until eventually a story emerges that is detailed enough to be presented as the suspect's own account, even though it has been sculpted through a collaborative process in which the interrogators served as unwitting, or sometimes quite witting editors. Perhaps no case illustrates the contamination problem more vividly than the interrogation of Brendan Dassey, a 16-year-old boy from Manitowoc County, Wisconsin, whose name became known to millions through the documentary series Making a Murderer, but whose story deserves to be understood as a devastating case study in how the interrogation process can manufacture guilt from the raw material of vulnerability and confusion. Brendan Dassey had an IQ measured at approximately 70, placing him in the borderline range of intellectual functioning, a young person who struggled in school, described by those who knew him as quiet and eager to please, who lacked the cognitive resources to comprehend what was happening when investigators began asking questions about the murder of Teresa Halbach, a 25-year-old photographer who had disappeared after visiting the Avery family salvage yard on October 31st, 2005. The interrogation transcripts read like a tutorial in contamination, a step-by-step demonstration of how crime scene details migrate from the minds of investigators into the mouth of a suspect who possesses neither the knowledge nor the sophistication to resist the process. Investigators asked Brendan what had happened to Teresa Halbach's head, a question that presupposes something happened to her head and invites the suspect to guess the correct answer, and when Brendan offered responses that did not match the evidence, the investigators guided him patiently toward the answer they were looking for, asking him to think about what else might have been done, until Brendan produced the detail they already knew, and this detail was then treated as if it had emerged spontaneously from his memory, as guilty knowledge that only a participant in the crime could possess. Throughout the interrogation, you can observe a pattern repeating with mechanical regularity. Brendan offers a response, the response is rejected, additional prompting is provided, and eventually a satisfactory response emerges, at which point they move on to the next detail, building a confession piece by piece like a mosaic assembled not from the suspect's memories, but from the investigator's knowledge of the crime. What makes the Dassey case particularly instructive is how his intellectual limitations interacted with the contamination process to produce a confession that was simultaneously detailed and deeply unreliable. Because Brendan was not merely susceptible to suggestion in the way that any exhausted person might be, he was fundamentally unable to understand the adversarial nature of the interrogation, unable to grasp that the investigators who told him they were on his side were in fact building a case that would result in his conviction for first-degree murder, unable to comprehend that every detail he agreed to was being recorded and would be used against him. And this intersection of cognitive vulnerability and investigative contamination produced what many legal scholars regard as one of the clearest examples of a coerced and contaminated confession in modern American criminal justice. The contamination problem extends far beyond individual cases because it represents a structural flaw in how confessions are evaluated, a flaw rooted in the assumption that details contained in a confession can be treated as independent evidence of guilt when those details may have originated not in the suspect's experience of the crime, but in the interrogation process itself. And until this flaw is addressed, until the legal system develops methods for distinguishing between details a suspect genuinely knew and details that were fed to them, the guilty knowledge argument will continue to function as one of the most powerful and least examined tools in the prosecutor's arsenal. A tool that transforms the contamination of confessions from a problem to be solved into a proof to be celebrated, from a flaw in the process into a feature of the outcome. And this brings us to another dimension of the interrogation process so extraordinary in its implications that it deserves to be considered not merely as a technique, but as a kind of licensed deception, a form of institutionalized dishonesty that would be considered fraud in virtually any other context, but which, in the peculiar world of American criminal interrogation, is not only permitted, but actively encouraged and defended by courts at every level. And this is the practice known as false evidence ploys, the legal right of American police officers to lie to suspects, to fabricate evidence that does not exist, to invent witness statements that were never made, to claim forensic proof that has never been collected, all in the service of extracting a confession from a person who may or may not be guilty of the crime under investigation. Consider for a moment the experience of an innocent person sitting in an interrogation room, a person who knows with certainty that they did not commit the crime, whose confidence in their own innocence is the only anchor they have, and imagine that a detective says with complete conviction that forensic technicians have found the suspect's fingerprints at the scene, that DNA analysis has matched their genetic material to evidence recovered from the victim, that a surveillance camera captured them entering the building, that their best friend has already provided a statement implicating them. None of these things are true. Not one. The fingerprints were never found. The DNA was never matched. The camera footage does not exist. The friend said nothing of the kind, and yet every single fabrication is perfectly legal under American law, endorsed by the Supreme Court in the 1969 case of Frazier versus Cupp, which established that deception by police during interrogation does not automatically render a confession involuntary, a ruling that opened the door to a practice that has since become so deeply embedded in American policing culture that many officers regard it not as deception at all, but simply as a legitimate and necessary investigative strategy, a tool for overcoming the resistance of suspects who would otherwise never admit to their crimes. The psychological impact on innocent suspects is profound, because these ploys attack the foundation upon which an innocent person's resistance depends: their confidence in the truth, their belief that the absence of real evidence will eventually become apparent. When a detective tells an innocent person that their DNA was found on the victim, something happens in the architecture of that person's certainty. Something shifts and cracks, because they are confronted with a seemingly impossible contradiction. They know they did not commit the crime, and yet here is a person in authority telling them that science itself, with all its authority and precision and supposed objectivity, has contradicted their certainty, has declared them guilty through the irrefutable language of molecules and chromosomes and genetic markers. For someone with robust cognitive resources and a clear memory of their whereabouts, this contradiction may be sustainable. They may reason that the police must be mistaken, or that some laboratory error has occurred. But for a person who is young, or intellectually limited, or mentally ill, or exhausted from hours of interrogation, or simply uncertain about the details of their life during the relevant period, the introduction of false evidence can trigger a catastrophic collapse of self-trust, a moment when the suspect begins to think that perhaps the police are right. Perhaps they did do this terrible thing, and somehow blocked it from their memory. And this is the point at which false evidence ploys intersect with coerced internalized false confessions, producing not merely a strategic decision to confess, but a genuine shift in the suspect's beliefs about what they have done. A terrifying moment when an innocent person begins to believe in their own guilt, because the alternative, that the police are lying about the evidence, seems less plausible than the possibility that their own memory is unreliable. This intersection means that the legal permission to lie to suspects is not merely producing false statements, but in some cases producing false beliefs, altering the suspect's understanding of reality, manufacturing guilt not just on paper, but in the mind of the accused, and this manufactured belief can persist long after the interrogation ends, creating a particular torment in which the person is imprisoned not only by physical walls, but by lingering doubt about whether they might actually be the monster the police said they were. It is worth pausing to consider how extraordinary this practice appears from an international perspective, because the United States stands virtually alone among Western democracies in permitting police to lie to suspects during interrogation. In the United Kingdom, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984, known as PACE, established a comprehensive framework for regulating police interrogation that includes a prohibition on deception to obtain confessions, and the impact has been profound, with researchers noting a significant reduction in false confessions following PACE's implementation. Germany prohibits deception during interrogation under Section 136A of its Code of Criminal Procedure, which explicitly forbids deception, threats, or promises to obtain statements. The Netherlands, Australia, and New Zealand have adopted similar prohibitions, recognizing that the short-term advantage of deceiving suspects is outweighed by long-term damage to the reliability of confessions and the integrity of the justice system as a whole. Japan, too, has implemented significant reforms to its interrogation practices in recent years, including the introduction of recording requirements that reflect a growing international consensus that transparency and honesty in the interrogation room are not obstacles to effective law enforcement, but prerequisites for a just system. Even Canada has moved toward restricting deception in interrogation, with courts increasingly scrutinizing the impact of police lies on the voluntariness of confessions. The contrast raises uncomfortable questions about the values embedded in the American system. Questions about whether a system that permits and indeed encourages law enforcement officers to fabricate evidence in the pursuit of confessions can truly be said to prioritize truth and justice over efficiency and conviction rates. And these questions become even more urgent when you consider that these techniques are disproportionately employed against precisely the populations most vulnerable to their effects. But there is a development that offers at least the possibility of reform, a development that began quietly in the late 20th century and has gained momentum since, and this is the movement toward mandatory recording of interrogations, a reform so straightforward in its logic that its slow adoption tells you something important about resistance to transparency that exist within certain corners of the law enforcement establishment, a resistance that raises its own set of troubling questions about what exactly is being protected by keeping the interrogation room sealed off from observation. The case for recording rests on the principle that if nothing improper is happening in the interrogation room, there should be no objection to creating a record, and if something improper is happening, a recording serves the interests of justice by making it visible. One of the earliest advocates was Thomas Sullivan, a former United States attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, whose credentials as a prosecutor insulated him from accusations of being soft on crime, a man who brought to the cause the authority of someone who understood from the inside both the pressures driving interrogation and the dangers that arise when the interrogation process operates behind closed doors in rooms where no independent record exists of what was said and done. Sullivan undertook a comprehensive survey of jurisdictions that had adopted recording requirements, and found that the fears expressed by opponents were almost universally unfounded. Suspects continued to talk, investigators adapted without losing effectiveness, and the modest cost of equipment was far outweighed by benefits to both confession reliability and officer protection against false claims of misconduct. Alaska was among the earliest adopters, following a 1985 decision by its Supreme Court in Stephan v. State, which held that due process required recording custodial interrogations, and that unrecorded confessions would be presumed inadmissible, a ruling initially met with resistance but eventually embraced, as officers discovered recordings actually served their interests. Minnesota followed, with its Supreme Court ruling in the 1994 case of State v. Scales that all custodial interrogations must be recorded in their entirety, and these two states served as proof of concept, demonstrating that recording enhanced evidence quality, reduced disputes about what had occurred, and contributed to a more transparent and accountable system of criminal justice, one in which the interrogation room was no longer a black box, but a space subject to the same scrutiny and oversight that governs other critical functions of law enforcement. The impact of recording on how confessions are perceived is dramatic, because when jurors have access to the full record rather than merely the final confession statement, they can observe the process by which the confession was produced, witness the hours of pressure and deception that preceded capitulation, see the leading questions and false evidence ploys and promises that shaped the suspect's decision to confess, and this visibility transforms the confession from a simple statement of guilt into a complex human interaction, whose reliability can be evaluated in its full and sometimes disturbing context, a context that often tells a story very different from the one the prosecution would prefer to present. But here, in the very reform that was supposed to bring transparency, researchers discovered another source of distortion, and this came through the work of Daniel Lasseter, a social psychologist at Ohio University, who conducted a series of experiments on the effect of camera angle on the evaluation of confession evidence. Lasseter's research revealed that the physical perspective from which an interrogation is recorded significantly influences how viewers perceive the voluntariness of the resulting confession. When the camera focuses on the suspect, the most common setup, viewers perceive the confession as more voluntary, because the visual frame centers the suspect as the primary actor, while the interrogator exists only as a voice from off-screen, a peripheral presence whose influence is minimized by visual absence. When the camera shows both suspect and interrogator equally, or focuses on the interrogator, perceptions change dramatically, with viewers becoming more attuned to pressure tactics, more aware of the power dynamic, more skeptical about voluntariness, and this shift occurs not because different information is presented, but because the same information appears from a different visual perspective, revealing how deeply our judgments about behavior are influenced by the literal angle from which we observe it. The implications are both practical and philosophical. Practical because camera angle is not a neutral technical decision, but a choice with consequences for how evidence is evaluated, and philosophical because they illuminate that observation is never truly objective, that recording inevitably involves decisions about framing that shape meaning. Some jurisdictions have responded by requiring equal focus camera angles capturing both parties, but many continue using suspect-focused angles, either from ignorance of the research or because the suspect-focused angle produces results that are more favorable to the prosecution, results that make confessions appear more voluntary and more reliable than they would if the full dynamics of the interrogation were visually apparent to every member of the jury. And this brings us to what may be the most intractable problem in the entire landscape of false confessions, a problem that persists even when recordings are available, even when expert testimony is presented, even when evidence of coercion is clear. And this is the problem of the jury, of how ordinary citizens evaluate confession evidence, of why intelligent and well-intentioned people consistently overvalue confessions and undervalue the very real possibility that an innocent person might confess to a crime they did not commit. A possibility that the research has shown is far more common than most people would ever want to believe. The jury problem is rooted in fundamental human psychology, beginning with a cognitive bias so pervasive that social psychologists call it the fundamental attribution error, the deeply ingrained tendency to explain other people's actions in terms of character and internal disposition, rather than in terms of the situations and circumstances in which those actions occur. When we see someone behaving aggressively, we conclude they are aggressive, not that they have been placed in a situation that is provoking aggression in a person who might otherwise be perfectly calm. When we see someone performing poorly at a task, our instinct is to conclude that they are incompetent, not that the task is unusually difficult or that the conditions under which they are working are unfavourable. And when we see someone confessing to a crime, our instinct, powerful and nearly irresistible, is to conclude they are confessing because they are guilty, because the confession reflects who they are, and not because they were placed in a situation of such extraordinary psychological pressure that confessing falsely became the most rational available response to irrational circumstances. The fundamental attribution error is not a flaw that can be corrected through instruction. It is a feature of human cognition that appears deeply wired into how we process social information, a default setting requiring conscious and sustained effort to override. And this is why telling jurors that a confession may have been coerced is so often insufficient to counteract the powerful intuition that a person who confesses must be guilty. The research of Saul Kassin, who has devoted decades of his career to understanding the psychology of confessions and their impact on the legal system, has produced findings that are as alarming as they are illuminating on this point. In a series of studies, Kassin and colleagues presented mock jurors with trial scenarios containing a confession, varying whether it was described as voluntary or coerced, and the results revealed a troubling pattern. Jurors told a confession had been coerced did report regarding it as less reliable, indicating they understood at an intellectual level that coercion compromises reliability. But when it came to the actual verdict, the coerced confession continued to exert powerful influence, producing conviction rates significantly higher than in conditions where no confession was present, even though jurors had been explicitly informed the confession was the product of coercion, and even though they acknowledged coerced confessions are less reliable. This suggests confession evidence operates on jurors at a level resistant to rational correction, that the mere knowledge that a person said the words "I did it" creates a psychological impression so powerful it cannot be neutralized by information about the circumstances under which those words were spoken. And this has profound implications for the legal system's capacity to protect the innocent who have been induced to confess, because even in cases where coercion is documented, even when the judge instructs jurors to disregard the confession, it continues to function as invisible weight on the scales of judgment, tilting outcomes toward conviction in ways jurors themselves may not fully recognize or understand. There is another dimension to the jury problem that may be even more fundamental, and it is the near-universal belief that I would never confess to something I did not do, a belief that functions as psychological armor against empathy, a barrier preventing jurors from imagining themselves in the position of the person who confessed. This belief is extraordinarily robust, held with equal conviction across all ages, educational levels and backgrounds, a shared article of faith in one's own psychological strength that says, no matter what the research shows, no matter how many documented false confessions are presented, this could never happen to me. I would hold firm. I would insist on my innocence. I would demand a lawyer. I would never say I did something I know I did not do. And this belief creates an empathy gap almost impossible to bridge, because jurors evaluate the defendant's confession not against what research says about human behavior under extreme pressure, but against their own imagined resilience, their fantasy of how they would behave in a situation they have never experienced, and in this comparison the defendant will always appear weaker or more suspicious, because the juror is comparing actual behavior in actual extreme stress to an idealized self-image in a hypothetical scenario existing only in the comfortable and untested realm of imagination, a realm where courage is always available, and clarity is never compromised, and the right words always come when they are needed. This illusion of personal immunity to false confession is maintained by the same attribution error, because when people imagine themselves in the interrogation room, they attribute their imagined resistance to their own character, while attributing the defendant's confession to the defendant's weakness or guilt, and in neither case do they give adequate weight to the overwhelming power of the situation, the crushing pressure the interrogation environment is specifically designed to create, the systematic elimination of every psychological resource that might support resistance, the sleep deprivation, the isolation, the deception, the false evidence, the implied threats, the explicit promises, the relentless repetition of the accusation hour after hour after hour. The jury problem is compounded by the legal framework, which places the burden of challenging a confession largely on the defendant, requiring them to convince the jury not only that the confession is false, but that the very concept of false confession is real and psychologically explicable, a task requiring them to overcome deeply held intuitions in limited time against prosecutors who have every incentive to maintain the perception that confessions are reliable, and before jurors whose beliefs about their own immunity predispose them to reject the defense argument. Expert testimony can help bridge this gap, and researchers like Kassin have spent countless hours testifying, explaining the science, describing the mechanisms, presenting the data, and sometimes this testimony has made a difference, but its effectiveness is limited by the adversarial nature of trial, in which the prosecution challenges the expert's credentials, questions the methodology, presents competing experts, and argues that the science of false confessions, however interesting it may be as an academic matter, simply does not apply to the specific case before them, because this defendant, unlike the subjects in laboratory studies, was a real person accused of a real crime, and his confession, they will argue, was real too. And so we are left with a system in which the very safeguard that is supposed to protect the innocent, the jury, is systematically compromised in its ability to perform this function when confession evidence is involved, compromised by cognitive biases built into the architecture of human thinking, by the illusion of personal immunity that prevents empathetic engagement with the experience of the accused, by the overwhelming intuitive power of a confession that operates on the mind like a gravitational field, pulling every other piece of evidence into its orbit, reinterpreting alibis as lies, reframing inconsistencies as consciousness of guilt, transforming the presumption of innocence into a presumption that must be overcome not by the prosecution but by the defense, because once a jury hears that the defendant confessed, the question in their minds is no longer whether the prosecution has proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but whether the defense can explain away the confession. And this inversion of the burden of proof is one of the most profound and least acknowledged consequences of the false confession problem, a consequence that reaches beyond the individual cases of wrongful conviction to touch the very foundations of the adversarial system of justice. As you lie here in the quiet of this moment, as the weight of these ideas settles around you, consider what it means that the system we have built to determine truth contains within it these hidden mechanisms of error, contaminating confessions with details that transform innocent statements into apparent proof of guilt, permitting deceptions that erode the confidence of the innocent in their own innocence, recording interrogations from angles that distort the perception of voluntariness, and presenting the results to jurors whose cognitive architecture predisposes them to believe that a confession must be true, that they themselves would never break, that the defendant must be different from them in some fundamental way, and that therefore the confession must be reliable, even when the evidence says otherwise, even when the science says otherwise, even when justice itself says otherwise, in a voice that grows quieter with each wrongful conviction, each life destroyed, each innocent person sitting in a prison cell because they said words that were not true in a room designed to make them say exactly those words fed to them and coached from them through a process we call interrogation, but that might more accurately be called a machine for the production of guilt, a machine that operates with terrible efficiency and that we have chosen to trust with the power to determine who is free and who is caged. A choice we make each day. We allow these practices to continue. Each day we fail to demand the reforms science has shown us are necessary. Each day we close our eyes to the contamination and the deception and tell ourselves the system works, that justice prevails, that the innocent have nothing to fear, when the evidence tells a very different story, a story continuing to unfold in interrogation rooms at this very moment, as someone who did not do the thing they are accused of sits beneath fluorescent lights and listens to a detective explain, with calm and practiced authority, that the evidence proves their guilt, that their only option is to confess, and that the truth, whatever it might actually be, no longer matters. And so we arrive at the question that has been quietly gathering force beneath everything we have discussed so far, the question that sits at the heart of every wrongful conviction, every coerced confession, every life shattered by the machinery of false certainty, and that question is simply this: if the methods used to extract confessions from innocent people are so deeply flawed, so fundamentally broken, then why do we continue to use them? And is there a better way? And the answer to that question begins not in a police station or a courtroom, but in a university laboratory, in the quiet, methodical, painstaking work of a psychologist named Saul Kassin, who has spent the better part of 4 decades trying to understand why innocent people confess to crimes they did not commit, and more importantly, trying to convince the criminal justice system that its most cherished assumptions about human behavior under interrogation are simply, demonstrably, catastrophically wrong. Kassin began his career at Williams College in the Berkshire Mountains of western Massachusetts, a place of quiet academic contemplation far removed from the gritty realities of police interrogation rooms, and later continued his groundbreaking work at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City, where the proximity to the courts and the police precincts and the holding cells gave his research an urgency that it might not have had in a more sheltered academic setting, and yet it was precisely his training as a researcher, his insistence on subjecting assumptions to empirical testing, rather than accepting them on the authority of tradition, that allowed him to see what those inside the system could not or would not see, and what he saw was a process built on a foundation of sand, a set of techniques that relied on assumptions about human psychology that had no basis in empirical reality, and he set out to prove it with the kind of rigorous, carefully designed experiments that would leave no room for doubt or equivocation. His most famous experiment, conducted in the mid-1990s with his colleague Catherine Keishel, was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications, and it has come to be known as the ALT key experiment, though its formal title in the academic literature is somewhat more restrained. The setup was this. Participants were brought into a laboratory and asked to perform a typing task on a computer alongside another person who appeared to be a fellow participant but was actually a confederate working with the researchers, and they were given one very clear instruction, one simple rule to follow, which was that they must not, under any circumstances, press the Alt key on the keyboard, because pressing the Alt key would cause the computer program to crash, and all the data from the experiment would be irretrievably lost. The participants sat down at the keyboard. They began typing as instructed, and then, after a predetermined interval, the computer screen went blank. The program appeared to crash, and the experimenter rushed into the room looking genuinely distressed and accused the participant of having pressed the forbidden Alt key, of having caused the crash, of having destroyed the data. Now here is the critical detail, the detail that makes this experiment so powerful and so profoundly unsettling. None of the participants had actually pressed the Alt key. Every single one of them was innocent of the accusation. They knew they were innocent. They had a clear, recent, vivid memory of not pressing the key, a memory that was only seconds or minutes old, a memory that should have been as solid and unshakable as any memory a person could possess. And yet when the experimenter confronted them with the accusation, when the pressure was applied, when the authority figure in the room declared with certainty that the participant had done the thing they knew they had not done, something remarkable and deeply troubling happened. In the baseline condition, where the experimenter simply accused the participant and asked them to sign a written statement, acknowledging that they had pressed the key and caused the crash, a startling number of innocent participants complied. They signed the confession, they put their name to a statement admitting something they knew they had not done, and the percentage was not trivial. It was not a handful of outliers or unusually suggestible individuals. It was a substantial proportion of the participants, enough to make any reasonable person pause and fundamentally reconsider their assumptions about the relationship between innocence and resistance to false accusation. But Cassin and Keishel did not stop there, because they understood that the real power of their experiment lay not in the baseline condition, but in what would happen when they introduced additional pressure, when they replicated, in miniature, the kind of corroborating evidence that police interrogators routinely present to suspects in real interrogation rooms. And so they introduced a second condition, a variation that would prove even more illuminating and even more disturbing, and in this condition they added a false witness, the confederate who was sitting in the room and who now claimed, when asked by the experimenter, to have actually seen the participant press the Alt key. This false witness looked at the innocent participant and said, with every appearance of sincerity and certainty, that yes, they had observed the forbidden key press, that they had watched the participant's finger come down on the ALT key, and the effect of this false corroboration was dramatic and immediate and profoundly unsettling. The confession rate soared to nearly 100%. Almost every participant in this condition signed the false confession, and many of them did something that Cassin found particularly fascinating and particularly alarming. They did not merely comply with the accusation in a grudging, skeptical, going along to get along sort of way. They actually began to internalize the false belief. They began to genuinely doubt their own memory. They began to think that perhaps they had pressed the key after all, that perhaps they had done it without realizing it, and they began to construct memories of pressing the key, to confabulate details about how and when they had pressed it, to weave the false accusation into the fabric of their own experience until it felt real, until it felt true, until the boundary between what had actually happened and what they had been told had happened dissolved entirely, and some of them, when debriefed after the experiment and told clearly and unambiguously that they had in fact not pressed the key, expressed genuine surprise and confusion, because by that point they had so thoroughly convinced themselves of their own guilt that the truth, the actual objective truth of what had happened, felt less real to them than the false narrative they had been led to accept. And this, Cassin argued with increasing urgency over the years that followed, was not an anomaly, not a laboratory curiosity with no bearing on the real world. but rather a window into the fundamental psychological mechanisms that operate in every interrogation room in every police station in the country. Because if innocent people could be made to confess to something as trivial and inconsequential as pressing a computer key in a low-stakes laboratory setting with no threat of punishment, no sleep deprivation, no isolation, no physical intimidation, no fear for their life or their freedom, then imagine what happens when those same psychological pressures are amplified 1,000-fold, when the stakes are not a crashed computer program but a life sentence or a death sentence, when the accusation comes not from a mild-mannered academic researcher, but from a trained interrogator who has been taught to project absolute unwavering certainty of guilt, who controls the physical environment, who controls the flow of information, who controls when the suspect eats or sleeps or uses the bathroom. Cassin went on to replicate and extend this finding in numerous subsequent studies over the following decades, each one adding another layer of evidence to the case against the prevailing methods of police interrogation, and his work eventually led him to a direct and sustained critique of the Reid Technique itself, the method that had dominated American law enforcement for half a century, the method that had been taught to hundreds of thousands of police officers and detectives across the country, the method that was considered the gold standard of interrogation training. And Cassin's critique was devastating in its precision because it struck at the very foundation of the Reid approach, at the assumption upon which the entire elaborate edifice was constructed. And that assumption was this: that trained interrogators can reliably detect deception through behavioral cues, that they can look at a suspect sitting across the table and determine, based on body language, facial expressions, eye movements, posture, fidgeting, gaze aversion, nervous laughter, the crossing of arms, the touching of the nose or the face, the shifting in the chair, the swallowing, the rate of blinking, whether that person is telling the truth or lying. This assumption, Cassin demonstrated through meticulous review of the scientific literature, was not merely unproven, but was actively contradicted by decades of research in the psychology of deception detection, research conducted by independent laboratories around the world, research that showed, with remarkable and discouraging consistency across hundreds of studies and across every population tested, that human beings are fundamentally poor at detecting lies, that we are barely better than chance at distinguishing truthful statements from deceptive ones, that even trained professionals, police officers, customs agents, judges, psychiatrists, people who make their living trying to distinguish truth from falsehood, perform at levels that hover around 50 to 54% accuracy, barely above the 50% you would expect from flipping a coin, and that the confidence with which a professional declares a suspect to be lying has essentially no correlation whatsoever with the accuracy of that declaration, meaning that the interrogator, who is most certain that the suspect is guilty, is no more likely to be correct than the interrogator who is riddled with doubt. The behavioral cues that the Reid Technique teaches officers to look for, Cassin explained, the fidgeting and the avoidance of eye contact and the nervous gestures, are not reliable indicators of deception at all, because innocent people who are accused of crimes they did not commit are very often nervous, very often fidgety, very often unable to maintain steady eye contact, precisely because they are terrified, precisely because they are sitting in a small room being accused of something terrible by an authority figure who clearly believes they are guilty, and their anxiety, their perfectly natural and perfectly innocent anxiety, their body's completely appropriate response to an extremely stressful situation, is misread by the trained interrogator as evidence of guilt, as confirmation that the suspect is indeed lying, as justification for moving forward with the full force of the confrontational interrogation. And this, Cassin argued, was the mechanism by which the Reid Technique produced false confessions, not through any single dramatic moment of coercion, but through a cascading series of cognitive errors that began with a flawed initial assessment of deception and then compounded themselves at every subsequent stage of the process. Because the Reid Technique is structured in such a way that once the interrogator has made that initial determination that the suspect is being deceptive, once that judgment has been rendered based on the unreliable behavioral cues, everything that follows in the 9-step process is designed not to test that judgment, not to challenge it, not to seek disconfirming evidence that might reveal the suspect is actually telling the truth, but to confirm it, to reinforce it, to build upon it, creating what Cassin called a self-fulfilling prophecy of guilt, a closed loop of confirmation bias in which the interrogator's initial belief generates the very evidence that appears to support it. Cassin called this investigator bias, and he demonstrated it experimentally in studies showing that interrogators who were told in advance that a suspect was probably guilty conducted fundamentally different interrogations than those told the suspect was probably innocent, that the mere expectation of guilt changed the interrogator's behaviour, their tone, their questions, their persistence, their willingness to accept denials in ways that increased the likelihood of obtaining a confession, regardless of the suspect's actual guilt or innocence. And remarkably, a better method already existed, developed thousands of miles away across the Atlantic Ocean in the United Kingdom, born not from academic theory, but from national scandal and shame, from the searing public recognition that the British criminal justice system had failed catastrophically and repeatedly, that innocent people had been convicted and imprisoned for years and decades on the basis of confessions that were coerced, fabricated, or extracted through methods that no just society should tolerate. The Guildford Four, Paul Hill, Jerry Conlon, Paddy Armstrong and Carol Richardson, were convicted in 1975 of bombing 2 pubs in Guildford, Surrey, killing 5 people and injuring dozens. Their convictions resting almost entirely on confessions obtained through brutal interrogation that included physical violence, threats against family members, and sustained psychological manipulation, and they spent 15 years in prison before their convictions were overturned in 1989 when it was revealed that police had fabricated evidence and suppressed exculpatory material. Jerry Conlon's father Giuseppe, convicted alongside his son in the Maguire 7 case, died in prison in 1980, an innocent man who never lived to see his name cleared. The Birmingham 6 men convicted that same year of bombing 2 pubs in Birmingham, killing 21 people, had their confessions obtained through severe physical beatings and spent 16 years imprisoned before their convictions were overturned in 1991. And then there was the case of Stefan Kiszko, perhaps the most heartbreaking of all, a quiet, gentle, socially isolated man of limited intellectual capacity who lived with his mother and had difficulty navigating even the ordinary social interactions of daily life. Convicted in 1976 of the murder of 11-year-old Leslie Molsid in Rochdale, Greater Manchester, after a police interrogation that systematically exploited his vulnerability, his confusion, his inability to understand what was happening to him, and his desperate, childlike desire to please the authority figures who surrounded him and told him what they needed him to say. Kiszko spent 16 years in prison, 16 years during which he was brutally and repeatedly targeted by other inmates because of the nature of his supposed crime, because child killers occupy the lowest rung of the prison hierarchy and are subjected to a particular and relentless cruelty. And when forensic evidence finally proved his innocence in 1992, and he was released, the damage was already done, irreversibly and completely done. His health was destroyed, his spirit was extinguished. The gentle man who had entered prison was gone, and in his place was a shell, hollowed out by suffering, and he died just 18 months after his release. A free man in name only, and his mother, who had fought with tireless, desperate, unrelenting devotion for his freedom across all those long years, died the year after that, as if her heart, having finally accomplished the one thing it had been beating for, simply had no reason left to continue. These cases and others forced the British government to acknowledge that its interrogation methods were producing false confessions at an alarming rate, and from that painful reckoning emerged the PEACE model, an acronym standing for Planning and Preparation, Engage and Explain, Account, Closure and Evaluation, representing not merely a new set of techniques, but a fundamentally different philosophy of what an interview with a suspect is meant to accomplish. Planning and preparation requires the interviewer to thoroughly review all available evidence, develop a clear plan for what information is needed, consider the suspect's background and vulnerabilities, and approach the interview with genuine openness rather than a predetermined conclusion. Engage and explain emphasizes building rapport, explaining the process honestly, treating the suspect with dignity, reflecting the research finding that people provide more accurate and detailed information when they feel safe and respected rather than threatened or deceived. Account requires allowing the suspect to provide a free narrative, to tell their story in their own words at their own pace without interruption or challenge, creating a record that can be checked against known facts while respecting the principle that the accused has the right to tell their side. Only after the free narrative does the interviewer move to more focused but still open-ended questioning, exploring inconsistencies gently rather than through aggressive confrontation. Closure involves summarizing what was discussed and allowing corrections or additions. Evaluation requires careful review of the information obtained during the interview, assessment of its consistency with existing evidence, identification of any gaps or contradictions that need further exploration, and a determination of what additional investigative steps may be needed, all of which reinforces the fundamental principle that the goal of the interview is not to obtain a confession, but to obtain accurate information, not to confirm a predetermined theory of guilt, but to discover the truth, wherever it may lead and however uncomfortable it may be. The philosophical difference between Reid and Peace is profound. Reid treats interrogation as a process of obtaining a confession from someone presumed guilty, while Peace treats it as information gathering from someone whose guilt or innocence remains undetermined. The evidence consistently shows that Peace produces more reliable information and fewer false confessions, and it has been adopted by the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Norway, and parts of Canada. Yet the American system has been remarkably resistant. There have been significant reforms. In 2017, Wicklander Zulawski and Associates, one of the largest interrogation training firms in the country, announced it would no longer teach the Reid confrontational approach, a seismic moment in which a respected industry firm publicly acknowledged the methods it had been teaching were fundamentally dangerous. A growing number of states have mandated recording of interrogations, creating objective records that make coercive tactics harder to conceal. The Innocence Project has been at the forefront of legislative advocacy, using the stories of exonerated defendants to build public support. But against these currents stands enormous institutional resistance, rooted not in malice but in the deep, unshakable belief held by thousands of officers, prosecutors, and judges that the system works, that confessions are reliable, that trained interrogators can distinguish truth from lies. Police academies continue teaching Reid or methods derived from it. Detectives resist the suggestion that their intuitions about deception are no better than a coin flip. Prosecutors are reluctant to embrace changes that make confessions harder to obtain, and politicians, ever attuned to the public appetite for toughness on crime, for the reassuring narrative that the system is catching the guilty and putting them away, are reluctant to champion reforms that their opponents might portray as coddling criminals or prioritizing the rights of suspects over the safety of communities, even when the suspects in question are demonstrably, provably innocent. The human cost of this resistance is embodied in Juan Rivera, convicted 3 times for the same murder in Waukegan, Illinois, based on a confession coerced over 4 days of relentless interrogation, despite DNA evidence excluding him as the perpetrator. 3 separate trials, 3 separate juries, and twice the system chose the coerced confession over DNA science, until the Illinois Appellate Court finally vacated his conviction in 2011, 19 years after his arrest, 19 years that encompassed the entirety of his young adulthood, every relationship he might have formed, every career he might have built, every ordinary joy he might have experienced, all consumed by a system that valued extracted words over scientific truth. And Rivera's case is not unique. It is not an outlier. It is one of hundreds of cases in which the American interrogation system has produced false confessions, leading to wrongful convictions, and the full scope of the problem may never be known, because for every Rivera who is eventually exonerated, there may be others who lack the resources or the legal representation or the simple good fortune to have their cases re-examined, who remain in prison cells serving sentences for crimes committed by someone else, their protests of innocence treated as further evidence of their recalcitrance rather than as the desperate truth they are. And so we return to where this story began, to the Central Park Five, the 5 boys, Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Yusuf Salam, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise, who in the spring of 1989 were accused, interrogated, coerced, convicted, and imprisoned for a crime they did not commit, and whose exoneration in 2002, following the confession of the actual perpetrator Matias Reyes confirmed by DNA, was not an ending but a beginning of a different kind of suffering. Each emerged into a world transformed during their incarceration, expected to resume lives as if years of violence, isolation, and dehumanization could simply be set aside. Research shows exonerees suffer post-traumatic stress, depression, and anxiety at rates comparable to combat veterans because false conviction fundamentally alters a person's relationship to the world and to themselves. Antron McCrae struggled for years with the psychological aftermath and the weight of a public identity forever linked to one of the most notorious crimes in New York history. Kevin Richardson spoke about how wrongful conviction steals not just years but possibilities, not just time but the person you might have become. Raymond Santana described re-entry as a second imprisonment, a prison of disconnection from a world that no longer felt familiar. And Corey Wise, sent to adult prison at 16, endured years of violence and solitary confinement that left marks on body and psyche that no amount of money could erase. In 2014, New York City agreed to pay $41 million, approximately $1 million for each year of wrongful imprisonment, the largest such settlement in the city's history, a formal acknowledgement of grave injustice. A moment in which the city that had taken so much from these 5 men finally admitted, in the language of dollars and settlements and legal agreements, that it had been wrong, that it had committed an act of profound institutional violence against 5 children who had done nothing wrong, and yet no amount could truly compensate for a stolen adolescence, for the years between 14 and 25 when a person forms their identity and discovers who they are meant to be, for the experience of sitting in a cell knowing you are innocent and knowing that no one is coming to help. And yet despite everything, the story of the exonerated 5, as they are now known, is also a story of remarkable resilience. And nowhere is this more powerfully illustrated than in Yusef Salaam, who in November of 2023 was elected to the New York City Council representing Harlem, the neighborhood from which he was taken as a 15-year-old boy, and to which he returned as a man determined to transform his suffering into service, a man who stood before his neighbors and said through the simple act of seeking their trust, "I am not what they said I was. I am what I have made myself, and I am here to serve you." His election represents something that transcends one individual's journey. Justice, his story tells us, is not merely the moment when the wrong is acknowledged and the innocent person is freed, but a beginning, a starting point for the difficult, ongoing, never-completed work of building a society worthy of the trust its citizens are asked to place in it. And as we sit with this knowledge, as we let these stories settle into our consciousness like sediment drifting through deep and still water, we are left with an uncomfortable and inescapable truth, a truth that resists the comfortable categories we use to organize the world. The interrogation room is one of the most psychologically powerful environments ever created by human beings, a space where the normal rules of cognition are suspended and replaced by a carefully engineered pressure system that can make anyone, truly anyone, say things they know are not true. This is not a matter of weakness or strength, not a question of character or moral fibre or intelligence or education. The human mind, for all its remarkable capabilities, is profoundly vulnerable to certain kinds of sustained social pressure, to the concentrated application of authority and isolation and fear and false certainty, and the interrogation room is designed with exquisite precision to exploit exactly these vulnerabilities. The person who declares with confidence that they would never confess to something they did not do is not expressing a truth about themselves, but revealing a failure of imagination, a failure to understand the conditions under which such a confession becomes not merely possible, but probable, a failure to appreciate the terrifying gap between who we believe ourselves to be in moments of comfort and safety, and who we actually become when that comfort and safety are systematically stripped away. The responsibility for protecting people from this vulnerability does not rest with the individual suspect, the frightened person sitting alone in a small room under harsh fluorescent lights facing an interrogator trained to break them. That responsibility rests with us, with all of us, with the society that creates and empowers and funds and oversees the institutions that administer justice in our name. Because when an innocent person confesses, it is not merely the individual who fails, it is the system, and it is we who fail, because we are the system. We are the ones who elect the politicians, who appoint the judges, who oversee the prosecutors, who direct the police, who conduct the interrogations. And every link in that chain is a point at which we could choose to do better, could choose to demand better, could choose to insist that the pursuit of justice be conducted in a manner truly worthy of the name. The fragility of truth is perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all, because we want to believe truth is robust, that it will prevail, and sometimes it does, as it did for the exonerated 5, for Juan Rivera, for the Guilford 4 and Birmingham 6 and Stefan Kisco. But it prevails in these cases not because the system works, but because it is forced to work by the tireless efforts of defense attorneys, innocence organizations, investigative journalists, and the exonerees themselves who refuse to stop declaring their innocence even when no one is listening. For every case where truth eventually emerges, there may be others where it does not, where the false confession stands unchallenged, where the innocent person serves out their sentence and returns to a world that still believes them guilty, or never returns at all, and we will never know their names because the system has no mechanism for finding its own mistakes and no incentive for looking. And so, as the night deepens and the shadows lengthen, and the noise of the waking world fades to a gentle hum beneath the silence, we are left with this: the knowledge that the criminal justice system, perhaps the most powerful instrument for justice ever devised by human civilization, is also in the wrong hands, under the wrong conditions, with the wrong methods, the most powerful instrument for injustice. And the line between the two is thinner than we would like to believe, as thin as the wall of an interrogation room, as thin as the space between a true statement and a false confession, as thin as the membrane that separates the person we are from the person we might become under the unimaginable pressure of being accused, alone, afraid, exhausted of something terrible that we did not do. The work of reform continues, slowly, fitfully, against enormous resistance. And it is work that will never truly be finished, because the temptation to take shortcuts, to trust intuition over evidence, to value confessions over truth, is woven into the very fabric of a system designed to process human beings through the machinery of justice at volume and at speed. And the only counterweight to that temptation is vigilance, the constant, tireless, unglamorous vigilance of citizens who understand that justice is not a destination but a practice, not a state of being but an ongoing act of will, and that the price of a just society is the willingness to question our own certainties, to doubt our own judgments, to listen to those who tell us something has gone terribly wrong, even when every institution insists that everything is fine. Let that thought settle gently into your mind as the night carries you towards sleep, not as a burden but as a quiet resolve, a whispered promise to the part of yourself that knows the difference between what is easy and what is right, between the certainty that comforts and the doubt that protects, between the confession that closes a case and the truth that sets a person free. The innocent deserve no less than our fullest attention, our deepest care, our most rigorous commitment to the principles that separate justice from mere power. And as you close your eyes and let the darkness gather around you like a gentle tide, carry with you the understanding that somewhere in some small room under harsh lights, a person is being asked to say words that are not true, and the only thing standing between that person and a lifetime of undeserved suffering is the fragile, precious, endlessly threatened commitment of a just society to seek the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, even when the truth is inconvenient, even when the truth is complicated, even when the truth refuses to fit neatly into the story we have already decided to tell, even when the truth demands that we begin again, humbly, honestly, together.